Welcome back. This is part 2 of beginning mixing techniques in Cubase. If you missed the first section, I'll leave that in the links below. Go back and check that one out because that's really going to cover all the things we're going to talk about in this video. We want to start working on things section by section. So just like building a house, we're going to start with the foundation and work our way up to the roof. In this case, we're going to start working on the drums. So we're going to solo the drum tracks, including the kick drum, and just listen to what we have. All right, not a bad sound. We're going to start working on this section and make it a bit more exciting. First thing we want to do is build a stereo image because right now everything is in mono. And we're going to use the panning control directly above the fader to accomplish that. And the kick and snare are generally in mono straight up, but the hats are usually off to one side. So we want to listen just to the overheads so we can determine where the hats actually were in the mix. If we solo it, all right, so the hats are actually a little off to the left. So if we play the overheads against the hi-hat track, we want to make sure those are still represented correctly so things don't get out of phase. All right, so that's about where the hats were in the overhead, so that makes a nice clean stereo image there. And as far as the toms, typically these would follow the stereo position of the drum set. So high toms leaning towards the left, mid toms in the center, and then the floor tom a bit more to the right. And we can verify that in the sound of the overhead mics as well. And then the room sounds and the overheads are stereo tracks, but all the other tracks are individual mono tracks, including the kick. In this project, we're not going to do anything to the kick track itself. The kick drum was recorded with an Audix D6 mic, which already puts it in the ballpark sound-wise, and it's a mono track, and we need some stereo effects. So we're going to work on the kick bus instead. And it's important to understand that the kick bus doesn't go to the drum's output. It goes direct to the stereo 2 bus. There's a really important reason for this. We don't want all those massive low frequency transients to fool the compressor on the drums bus or any effects on the drums bus. So instead of going to the drums bus, we're going to treat it independently and go straight to the master bus. All right, so not a bad sound altogether, but it needs a little help. First thing we're going to use is Steinberg's utility compressor, and this is a great surgical compressor. It doesn't have a ton of character, so it's very transparent. It's great for just fixing things, and we're just going to use it to rein in some of the transient in the performance. So we're going to set the ratio setting for about 5.7 with a fairly quick release, and the lower we drop the threshold slider, the more the compressor is going to wake up and start doing something. So we're just going to bring the level up just a hair, and we're just taking some of the highest transients off. This is just to keep the track from clipping into the red. And the next thing we're going to add is an EQ. And this is Steinberg's EQ P1A. This is its Pultec copy, and it's a really good Pultec copy. And we're going to do something unique with it. There's a Pultec trick, if you've ever used or owned a Pultec, where you boost and cut at the same time. So we boost and cut the same amount exactly, 7.9 dB, and we're going to do it around 75 hertz. So this is what it sounds like without it. This is what it sounds like with it. And you can hear a massive difference there. And this is just a trick that happens to work with all Pultec EQs. You could kind of accomplish the same thing with a regular EQ, but you'd have to work a lot harder at it. Steinberg makes it a lot easier, and this particular EQ just happens to sound great on it. So let's move on to the snare. We're going to do the same thing because if we solo the snare bus, it solos just the snare track there. And in this particular recording, we don't have a top and bottom snare. We just have the single snare track. All right, so as you can tell, pretty indicative of, an acoustic snare. Not super exciting. We're going to change that. We're going to use Steinberg's vintage compressor. This is basically just an 1176 FET style compressor, one of the most famous compressors ever made, very commonly used on snares because it really helps bring out the snap and the attack of the snare drum. So let's listen to it before, and then we'll listen to it after. So we're moving the attack so that we get a nice kind of snappiness to it. And we're using the fastest release time with a 4:1 ratio. And like I said, we could go on and on about how to do this, and we'll get into compressor theory more and more. But for the time being, we're just trying to get the snare to have a bit more attack. All we're going to do is use this to change the character of the snare itself. And then we're going to use an EQ following that just to sculpt the sound a little bit. So here's before. And this is after. Brought up a little bit of the snappiness, took out some of that mid-range ring in both the mids and then the really low end here. Maybe not quite as much, still keep that bottom end snap. And then we're going to follow it just like we did on the master bus with a limiter. And the reason why is because the two loudest things in a mix almost always are the snare drum and possibly the kick. And then that's balanced out by the vocals. It's kind of a triangle of reference. So if you can get those three things correct, if you can get your kick, your snare, and your vocals to all sit in the mix correctly, the rest of the mix is a lot easier. And again, with the limiter, we're not going to be doing much here. These are going to be subtle settings. We're just going to keep it under 0 dB with a fairly fast release. And all that's going to do is just catch the very peaks of it. All right, now that's the snare track. Now we want to move over to the snare bus itself because this is going to need a little bit more help to sound a bit more like a commercial snare. We're going to come up here and the first thing we're going to do is add a reverb. It's an IR style reverb, which means it uses impulse responses. So they're recordings of reverb spaces, and a plate reverb, for example, is a really good way to make the snare sound a little bit more ambient, and it's a stereo sound. So the snare bus is a stereo bus as opposed to the snare track being mono, and this allows us to use stereo effects. Pull up the volume a little bit. All right, and then we're going to follow that with an EQ. If you remember our signal flow discussion in the last video, this will be downstream from the reverb, which means the EQ will affect the reverb. Here's what it sounds like before. After. Adds just a little bit of pretty shimmery top to the reverb, and we're going to do the exact same thing as we did on the track itself. We're going to add a limiter with the same features. It's just going to catch the peaks if things get a little too wild and out of hand. All right, let's listen to the kick and the snare together. All right, so you notice the snare doesn't sound nearly as big and ambient as the kick does, and that's because the snare sound, the total snare sound, is combined with a lot of different things, not just the snare track by itself, but it's also the room sound and the overheads. They're the other 2/3 of the snare sound. So those are really important parts we have to include as well. Moving on to toms, just like the snare, the tom sound is comprised of more than just the sound of the tom's bus by itself. So if we listen to the tom's break and we just listen to the bus that they're all assigned to, all right, so pretty dry and pretty uninspiring tom sounds there. And also you'll notice that we're not gating a lot of the toms either. We're leaving them pretty open so we can really hear the interplay between the different drums. We could put a bunch of gates on here if we had a lot of spill and over, but this has been pretty clean so far, so we're going to leave it the way it is. And we're going to add a vintage compressor on this, and this is basically just going to tighten up the toms a little bit. This is what it sounds like before. These are going to bring them up a little bit. This is after. Basically the same thing we did on the snare. We're moving the attack knob around until we get a snappier, more punchy sound. Now we're going to take an EQ and follow that with it, and this just sculpts them a bit, adds a little bit of high end. This is before. This is after. So it just adds a bit of snap to it. And then the final thing we're going to add on just the tom's bus itself is a reverb. And the reverb adds its own space and identity to it. This is before. This is after. This is just a short haul reverb preset. You could also use a plate. And this just gives it a little bit of space. And when we combine that with the overheads, listen to the overheads by itself. And then we combine that with the tom's track. That makes a huge difference because those two sounds combine to make that total tom sound. Moving on to the overheads bus, which is basically a snapshot of the overall drum sound, but it also includes cymbals as well. We're going to add Steinberg's frequency EQ to the overheads bus, and that's going to allow us to sculpt out some of the bottom end. We don't need the kick information in there so much. So we're going to pull some of that out by this low shelf here. Here's width. Let's solo the kick, snare, and overheads together. Snare starts to wake up a whole lot more because now we've added all of that additional overhead sound to it as well. All right, and the last thing on the overheads that we're going to do is just add that same tube compressor, and this is going to do the same thing. It's just going to cut the top of it off and rein it in a little bit, and that brings the room up a little bit more. So let's listen to the overall sound. That's without it, and this is with it. As you can hear, the overhead's job is to bring out the drum set sounds, but also the cymbals and things like the hi-hat sound as well. Moving on to the drums bus, whose job is to unify everything as a single instrument. It's going to include the snare, the toms, the overheads, as well as the room microphones. Now, obviously the kick's not going into that because we don't want it to fool the compressors, but we're going to add one more compressor to our drums mix, and that's the Steinberg's tube compressor. We're going to use this, but instead of this just being in there to kind of take the top off and just sort of add a little bit of glue, this is going to add a ton of character instead. So this is what the drums bus sounds like before the drum compressor. Not bad. This is what it sounds like with. Yeah. And that's largely due to these two things right here. The drive knob and the character knob. These are adding subtle character and saturation effects to the overall compressor. So it's not just a compressor, it's actually a saturator as well. Let's start adding some bass guitar to it as well. Let's push up the bass bus slider. All right, it's not a bad sound, but we've got a lot of work to do to bring it up to commercial standards. So we're going to do some things on the bass track over here first. And the first thing we're going to add is Steinberg's black valve compressor. This is a great bass compressor, and it's really set up to do that. So we're going to add the bass thickener preset, and this already kind of puts it in the ballpark, adds some grit and distortion to it, and a tiny bit of compression. Let's hear what it sounds like. All right, so as you can hear, it's got some distortion going on. It gives it a little bit of character. We're going to back that off just a hair, and we're going to raise the peak reduction, or effectively the compression amount, until it's peaking, or it starts to reduce right around -3. This is just going to help rein in the dynamic part of the performance. We don't want it doing too much work here because we're also going to have a compressor on the bass bus itself. All right, that's going to work great for now. And the second thing on the track is going to be Steinberg's frequency EQ. This is a really powerful EQ, but one thing it's really unique at doing is it can both be a static EQ or a dynamic EQ. What that means is simply that in its regular position, it's simply a regular EQ. You can drag and, and pull these controls anywhere you want. But by pressing this little dynamic button right here, this turns it into a dynamic EQ. And a dynamic EQ is kind of like a cross between a compressor and an EQ, meaning it's actually going to compress just this frequency range by an amount. So let's turn this on and see what that does. This little slider here is going to determine how much actual reduction takes place around this frequency area. So that's nothing. And as we drop the threshold, the compressor actually starts to do something around 125 or 30 hertz. And this is just because the bass is prominent in that area. We're also going to add a little bit of mids to it just to get some of that mid-range growl out of the bass as well. All right, that's all we're going to do with the EQ. So let's jump over to the bass bus itself now. On the bass bus, we're also going to add another compressor, and this is the vintage compressor, and we're going to choose the rock bass preset. And this just gets it in the ballpark, but it's going to do way too much work because in its basic configuration, watch the meter. It's doing way too much reduction here. So we're just going to drop the input a little bit, because remember how we talked about how sometimes using 2 compressors can do a better job than 1. All right, now the output is really low because this is really dialed back. So we're simply going to bring that up. Now the last thing we're going to add is just a tiny bit of ambience by adding a reverb. And this is something that we cannot do on the bass track because the bass track is mono. But this is the bass bus, and that's a stereo bus, and that allows us to use ambient stereo effects. All right, so let's see what that sounds like. And when we put everything together, it sounds like this. All right, now it's time to add some guitar to our production, and we've got some funk guitar going on. And because it's a mono track, it's straight up in the mix. Let's listen to what that sounds like. All right, so the first thing we have to do is our stereo image. We need to put it someplace, and we're going to move it over to the left a little bit. And this is just to give the guitar a little bit of identity, since it's going to be opposite the keyboard parts. And the first thing we're going to add is an EQ to it. And this is going to be a very simple EQ. We're going to use frequency just to roll off a little bit of the bottom end that we don't need in the electric guitar part. And in addition, we're going to use the dynamic EQ part we used earlier on the bass to roll off just a little bit around 100 Hertz. So this is what it sounds like before. And this is what it sounds like with. And this is really subtle. We're not doing much here. We're just actually making sure that there's not low-end information sneaking into the guitar part we don't need. The next thing that we're going to put in here is the tube compressor. And this is really just going to take off the top of the guitar part itself when it gets really dynamic and slappy. So it's not doing a ton of work here like before. This is really just to rein in the dynamic performance of it. So that's what it sounds like before. And this is what it sounds like with the compressor on it. So you can see pretty subtle settings here. It's set up so that it really only does about -2 or 3 total reduction. And the attack knob here is set so that some of that initial attack or guitar pick sound makes it through the compressor before it wakes up and starts doing something. And in addition, we're going to put one more effect on it. Even though it's mono, we're going to put a mono delay on here. Now, this just adds a little bit of depth and life to it, and we can actually press the sync button here, and that means it's going to follow the tempo of the project. That makes our delays a lot easier to set. If we click on the delay here, we can set it at any of these values. We're going to choose 1/8, and we're going to bring the mix up to about 6%. This is what it sounds like before with no delay. This is what it sounds like with it. This is really subtle, but it's just to give it a little bit of life and help it sit in the mix. All right, we're going to go back over to the guitar bus now, which is a stereo bus. And we're going to use that same tube compressor again, and we're going to use it the same way. Some fairly moderate settings here, but in addition, we're going to add a little drive to it, which is going to warm it up just a hair, and we're going to add a little bit of character to it. This, however, the attack knob is actually going to be the fastest it can be, because the purpose of this is to, almost like a limiter, keep the top from clipping the channel. We don't want this to get out of control when the guitar player really digs into the strings. This is what it sounds like before. All right, and this is what it sounds like after. And the great thing about the tube compressor is that it's really good for adding a little bit of saturation, even when the compressor is not doing a ton of work. And much like the bass that we did, we're going to do the exact same thing with the guitar. The last effect we're going to add here is its own reverb. And this is going to be a spring reverb. So this is going to be very guitar-like, because a lot of guitar amplifiers have spring reverbs in them. It's a very specific kind of sound. This is what it sounds like before. And this is what it sounds like after. Spring reverbs are really kind of a magical sound. They really add a lot of life and depth to something without adding a ton of actual reverb sound to it. And it's such an iconic sound. It really sounds like an amplifier from a guitar. And you don't need much. 7 to 10% is usually plenty. So let's solo the track so we can hear it. Let's hear the whole thing together. All right, you guys have done a great job so far at putting together a basic mix. So stay tuned for the third and final part of this mix series, where we'll get into building custom vocal chains and see how all of these parts work together and how they affect the master bus. We'll catch you guys in part 3.